Hey guys, my name's Jordan, and in this video we're going to be talking about photography for aquariums. I'm going to do a big maintenance on this tank behind me to get it ready for the photographs, and then we're going to talk about some maybe photography for competitions or Instagram or other social media platforms, or even just personal use. So we're going to get into that right now. So just starting off with my weekly maintenance, I like to do about a 1/3 water change every week, but today maybe we'll do a wee bit more just because we want the water to be extra clear for the photograph. I like to do the general maintenance such as cleaning the glass, trimming the plants, and of course just the water change itself. While you're doing water change, it's probably a good idea to clean things like your diffuser, your CO2 diffuser, and maybe your lily pipes. For the lily pipes, sometimes I just like to just clean it under a tap, but for the diffuser, I like to put it in a bleach solution or a chlorine solution. I like to use the ADA Superge, and that cleans it pretty nicely. This tank is kind of overgrown right now, so I'm going to do a trimming on the tank. I'm kind of trying to still keep the aesthetic because we're kind of doing photo shoots today, but I kind of just want to shape it up a bit and make sure the tank's looking nice. So when taking photography shots for my Instagram or for just personal use or other social media platforms, or even if I'm entering a competition, I haven't actually entered any competitions in the past, not any big ones really, so I might do that in the future, but the basic principles still apply. If you're using a DSLR camera like a 70D like me, or if you're using a mobile phone, then I kind of recommend shooting in RAW. This allows you to edit just more easily and edit the shadows better and things like this. In post. Highly recommend doing that and shooting in RAW rather than shooting in a JPEG format. I won't go into too much detail about the camera and the settings, but there's 3 things you really want to look out for when you're taking a photograph. You want to look out for your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture. Your ISO is kind of like a fake light, and you kind of want to keep this as low as possible depending on how bright your room is. If you're going to go too high on ISO, you're going to end up with kind of like a grainy image, and that's not desirable at all. Your shutter speed is kind of what it says. It's how quickly you'll take the photo. If you're going to do a low shutter speed, you might end up with like blurry water or even maybe blurry fish. So you want to keep your shutter speed at a point where the fish aren't too blurry, or the water is not too blurry. You want to have a crisp photo, but at the same time your shutter speed also lets in more light the lower it is, and if it's really high, then you're kind of darkening your image a bit too much. Generally my shutter speed is in between say 125 to 200, although we can always increase it. I don't really recommend going much below 100 really, because they end up like with blurry fish, blurry shrimp, blurry everything. So do take that into consideration when you're doing so. My aperture is fairly low most of the time because when shooting indoors it's quite dark. But if you have more light above your tank, you can get away with using a wee bit higher of aperture. The reason that you want a higher aperture is that it keeps more things in focus. If you have a low aperture or a low f-stop, you have a shallow depth of field, so you'll get this kind of like blurry background, but in the same respect that you might get the back of the tank slightly blurry and the front of the tank really in focus. So you got to kind of balance it out in that sense, but obviously if your room is dark, a lower f-stop or a lower aperture will give you more light because it widens the aperture in the lens, and a higher aperture closes it down so that there's not as much light coming in. So you got to play with these 3 factors: your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed, to kind of balance your exposure and your lighting in your room basically. And if you're using your phone for photography, that's perfectly fine as well. As long as it's a newer phone, and the camera quality is up to scratch, you're perfectly fine to use that for Instagram, personal use, and even competition shots. Probably the most important thing apart from the camera would be a tripod. This locks your camera or your mobile phone on and out of movement. So if you're using your hands, you might be swaying, or you might not be actually still enough, and they might get a bit more blurry, kind of blurry plants or a blurry fish in the photo. So buying a tripod, or even just a really cheap tripod for your phone, it'll make wonders of a difference. So buy a tripod. When you're editing your photos, I kind of recommend not to over edit, especially if you're using a JPEG and not RAW. If you're editing a JPEG, you kind of want to have a light touch to editing photos, and if you're using RAW, you can get away with editing a bit more. But in the same respect, I wouldn't go, put the saturation way up, or the vibrance way up, or the sharpening, or the clarity. That's one thing I see a lot, is people over editing their photos and making it like crazy. It just doesn't look nice, doesn't look natural. So have a light touch on editing. It'll go a long way. In a lot of competitions, they say that you cannot edit your photos, or that you shouldn't edit your photos. But I believe that when you're taking a JPEG, on your phone or in a camera, it's sort of editing the photo to the way the camera thinks it should perceive the final image. If you're taking a RAW photo, it's unprocessed, unedited. I believe that you can edit this raw data and export it into a JPEG using the same kind of like editing it the same way as the camera would, to your own liking. I think that's totally acceptable, as you can, generally you can only send them JPEGs and you can't send the raw photos. So I think that's totally acceptable if you're only changing the exposure, the sharpness, the contrast, etc., and you're not, copying and pasting fish in a certain way, or taking this plant and copying it. I don't think that's definitely not acceptable, but definitely just the general editing is totally fine. It's important to note that you should actually read the guidelines for photography on the competition's website and follow their guidance. My guidance is just what I perceive the competition's guidance as. So read the guidelines, make your own assumptions, and do what you think is right, basically. If you're taking photography for your Instagram, then you can just leave the equipment in the tank. But if you're kind of doing a competition shot, or just want a cleaner final shot of your aquarium, you kind of want to be removing the pipes, removing the diffuser, removing the lighting fixture, or raising it higher. It'll make a huge difference. So definitely clean up your tank, remove all the equipment, all the visible equipment, and take a photo that way. So guys, I hope you've enjoyed the video. Let me know in the comments below if you've learned anything today, or if you have any questions, just pop them down in the comments and I'll be sure to answer them. And like always, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye guys.